Hey there, welcome back. If you are new here, settle in, get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up a little higher, find that one pillow that sits just right, and take a slow breath. Because tonight we are not talking about one king or one battle or one interesting Tuesday in history. Tonight we are doing the whole thing. The entire Roman Empire, from a couple of brothers arguing over a hill to the last flicker of a civilization that shaped nearly everything you see around you today. Yes, all of it. The founding, the kings, the republic, the wars, the dictators, the emperors, the scandals, the decline, and the long quiet fade into history. It is a story that spans over 1,000 years, involves hundreds of emperors, thousands of battles, and at least one man who thought he was a god. Which, to be fair, several men thought. So make yourself comfortable, dim the lights a little, let your shoulders drop, and let us begin at the very beginning, which is, as beginnings go, surprisingly messy. The world before Rome. Before there was Rome, there was just a river. The Tiber River winding its way through central Italy, past rolling hills and scrubby forests, past shepherds and small farming villages that had no particular ambitions beyond the next harvest. It is around 1000 BCE, give or take, and the Italian peninsula is a patchwork of different peoples. The Etruscans in the north with their sophisticated cities and mysterious language, the Greek colonies dotting the southern coasts, and scattered Latin tribes in the middle, farming their fields, herding their animals, doing what people have always done, which is mostly just trying to survive the winter. No one at this point looks at the hills above the Tiber and thinks, yes, that is where we will build the most powerful civilization the Western world has ever seen. No one thinks that at all. They are thinking about goats. But something is stirring slowly the way most important things stir without anyone noticing. Small settlements are clustering together on the Palatine Hill, then the Capitoline, then the others, 7 hills in total, as if the land itself was gathering these people towards something inevitable. This cluster of villages, this muddy, noisy, ambitious little collection of huts and fences and cooking fires, will one day look out across 1,000,000 square miles of territory. But first they need a founding story. And the Romans were very good at founding stories. Romulus and Remus. The founding myth. The story goes like this. A king named Numitor was overthrown by his brother Amulius, who, wanting no rivals, forced Numitor's daughter into a life of religious celibacy. Her name was Rhea Silvia, and she was supposed to remain childless, which would have been a very tidy solution to the problem of inheritance. Unfortunately, she had twins. The father, she claimed, was Mars, god of war, which is exactly what you would say if you needed a convincing explanation, and also needed the king to think twice before punishing you. The king was not convinced. He ordered the twins thrown into the Tiber to drown. The servants charged with this task, finding that the river was flooded, simply left the basket on the bank and walked away, which is the sort of half-hearted execution that changes history. A she-wolf found the twins and nursed them, and a shepherd named Faustulus eventually raised them as his own. Their names were Romulus and Remus. They grew up, overthrew Amulius, restored their grandfather to power, and then set off to found their own city on the hills above the Tiber. And here is where the story gets characteristically Roman. The brothers argued about which hill to build on. Remus chose the Aventine, Romulus chose the Palatine. They decided to read omens from birds. Remus saw 6 vultures. Romulus claimed to see 12. There was a dispute about who saw their birds first. Voices were raised and Romulus killed his brother. Just like that. The founder of Rome, in the very founding of Rome, committed fratricide. The Romans knew this story. They told it willingly. They seemed almost proud of it, as if violence and ambition at the very root of things was simply being honest about the nature of civilization. Romulus named the city after himself, because of course he did, and the traditional date of this founding is 753 BCE, which gives us a convenient place to start. So there is your city. Built on a hill, watered by a river, founded in blood, and named after the man who shed it. Rome. The Roman kingdom. For the first 2.5 centuries of its existence, Rome was a kingdom ruled by kings, which sounds simple and perhaps a little dull, but the Roman kings were anything but dull. There were 7 of them by tradition, though the number is suspiciously tidy, and they range from the legendary to the genuinely historical. Romulus himself, the fratricide, was the first, and by accounts was a competent, if ruthless ruler, who organised the early city, established the Senate as an advisory body, and managed to fill his new city with people by the creative method of inviting refugees and runaway slaves and criminals to come and live there. Rome in its earliest days was essentially a city that said, "We will take anyone." This was not glamorous, but it was effective. The city grew. The kings after Romulus represent a fascinating mix of cultures that shaped early Rome, an era reflected in names that are sometimes Latin, sometimes Etruscan, sometimes Sabine, as if Rome was absorbing everything around it even then. Numa Pompilius established religious institutions and a calendar that was frankly terrible but everyone used anyway for centuries. Tullus Hostilius conquered the Latin city of Alba Longa and earned his name through sheer enthusiasm for fighting. Ancus Marcius built the first bridge over the Tiber, which was a very useful thing to do. Then came the Etruscan kings, Tarquinius Priscus and Servius Tullius, who brought Etruscan sophistication to the growing city temple's engineering organisation. And finally Tarquinius Superbus Tarquin the Proud, the last king. His name tells you everything you need to know about how this ended. The birth of the Republic. Tarquin the Proud was by all accounts exactly as unpleasant as his name suggests. He ruled. Without consulting the Senate, he had enemies murdered, he taxed the people heavily and worked them like animals on grand building projects. And his son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed a terrible crime against a noblewoman named Lucretia, who afterward took her own life rather than live with the shame, which is a tragedy that the Romans understood entirely in terms of honour. Her kinsman Lucius Junius Brutus, yes, a Brutus organised the outrage of the aristocracy into something decisive. The Tarquins were expelled in 509 BCE, and Rome became a republic. Now the republic was not a democracy in any way you would recognise today. Let us be very clear about that. It was a system designed specifically to make sure that no one person ever had too much power, which was a fine idea in theory and a complicated mess in practice. 2 consuls were elected each year, sharing executive power, each able to veto the other, each serving for only 12 months before returning to private life. The Senate, a body of aristocrats and former officials, guided policy, controlled finances, and conducted diplomacy. The idea was that by spreading power among many, by making everything temporary, by building in constant checks, you could prevent any one man from becoming a king again. And for several hundred years it worked. Mostly. With interruptions, patricians and plebeians. The long struggle. Imagine you are a Roman citizen in the early Republic around 480 BCE, and you are not a patrician. You are a plebeian, which means you are the vast majority of the Roman population. You are farmers and craftsmen and traders and soldiers. You do most of the work, you fight in most of the wars, and you have essentially no political power whatsoever. The patricians, the noble families who trace their lineage back to the original Senate appointed by Romulus, hold all the offices, interpret all the laws, and own most of the land. You cannot hold high office. You cannot marry a patrician. You do not even know what the laws are most of the time because they are not written down. They are just interpreted by patrician priests whenever there is a dispute, which conveniently always seems to go in the patrician's favour. This was not sustainable. The Romans, to their credit, figured out a mechanism for managing this tension that was remarkably creative. The plebeians simply left. They walked out of the city, refused to work, refused to fight, refused to do anything, and told the patricians to figure out how to run a city and an army all by themselves. This was called the conflict of the orders, and it unfolded over the better part of 2 centuries through a series of these walkouts and negotiations and gradual concessions. The patricians, discovering that a city without workers is just a collection of empty buildings, made concessions. The laws were written down, the 12 tables, around 450 BCE, so everyone could actually know what they were. Tribunes of the plebs were created officials with the sacred power to veto any action by any magistrate that harmed a plebeian. Eventually plebeians could hold, the consulship could become priests, could marry patricians. By around 287 BCE, with the last major plebeian legislation, the conflict was technically resolved. Rome was still deeply unequal, but it had developed a habit, a genuinely remarkable habit of resolving internal conflicts through negotiation and law, rather than simply slaughtering everyone who disagreed. This habit would serve it well for a while, and then eventually it would forget it. The Punic Wars Rome meets Carthage. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had conquered most of the Italian peninsula through a combination of military force, generous alliance terms, and the simple logic that it was better to be Rome's friend than its enemy. Roman citizenship, or the next best thing, was extended to many conquered peoples. Roads were built, Roman roads straight and well paved and built to last, connecting the peninsula into something that functioned as a unit. And then Rome looked outward. Across the narrow strip of water separating Sicily from North Africa there was Carthage. Carthage was everything. Rome was not a great maritime trading empire based in what is now Tunisia. Rich and cosmopolitan and ancient, with a navy that dominated the western Mediterranean and mercenary armies that had fought across Spain and Sardinia and Sicily for generations. The two powers bumped into each other in Sicily in 264 BCE. What followed were the Punic Wars, 3 of them spanning over a century, and they are among the most consequential conflicts in ancient history. The First Punic War was largely about Sicily and largely about naval power. Rome, which had essentially no navy, built one, lost it, built another, lost that one too, and eventually built a third one and won, which tells you something important about Roman persistence. The Second Punic War is the famous one because of Hannibal. Hannibal Barca was a Carthaginian general of extraordinary gifts, who crossed the Alps with an army and war elephants in 218 BCE, lost most of the elephants in the process, which was a shame, and then proceeded to spend 15 years marching around Italy, defeating Roman army after Roman army. At Trebia, Roman loss. At Lake Trasimene, Roman loss. At Cannae, in 216 BCE, one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. Perhaps 5,000 Romans, killed in a single afternoon through the brilliance of Hannibal's encirclement tactics. And Rome, despite all of this, refused to negotiate. The Allies mostly held. The Roman system of governance, all those roads and citizenship grants and carefully managed relationships held together under pressure that would have shattered a less integrated state. While Hannibal won battle after battle in Italy, unable to take Rome itself, the Romans sent armies to Spain, cut off his reinforcements, and eventually under the general Scipio Africanus took the war to Africa. Hannibal was recalled to defend Carthage. At Zama, in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated him. Carthage was stripped of its overseas territory, its navy, most of its independence. The Third Punic War, which came 50 years later, was almost embarrassingly one-sided Rome, destroyed Carthage utterly in 146 BCE, burned it, salted the earth, sold the survivors into slavery. There is a famous story that Cato the Elder ended every speech in the Senate with the words, "Carthage must be destroyed," regardless of what the speech was actually about, which says something about Roman tenacity and also about what it must have been like to sit in the Senate with Cato the Elder. The crisis of the Republic. Rome had become, by the 2nd century BCE, the dominant power in the Mediterranean world, and this success was creating problems that no one in the early Republic had anticipated. The wealth flowing in from conquered territories was pooling at the top in the hands of the great aristocratic families and the new class of businessmen called equestrians, while the small farmers who had formed the backbone of the Roman army were losing their land. The wars had kept them away from their farms for years at a time, and when they came home they found their farms had been bought up or absorbed by large estates, worked by slaves. The slaves being one of the other things that flowed in from military victories. A landless Roman citizen could not serve in the army, which required soldiers to provide their own equipment, and so Rome found itself with a paradox. More victories, creating more poverty, creating fewer eligible soldiers. 2 brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, tried to address this in the 130s and 120s BCE through land reform, redistributing public land to the poor. They were both killed for their efforts. And with their deaths, something cracked in the Roman political culture. The willingness to resolve conflict through law and negotiation, that habit the Republic had developed, began to erode. Violence entered the political arena, and once it entered, it was very difficult to ask it to leave. The army reforms of the General Marius around 107 BCE solved the soldier shortage by allowing landless men to serve with the state providing their equipment, but this created soldiers whose loyalty was to their general rather than to the abstract Roman state, because their general was the one who would give them land when the war was done. When Marius and his rival Sulla fell into open conflict, Sulla did something that had been unthinkable. He marched his army on Rome itself. The Republic survived technically, but it had learned a lesson it could not unlearn. Armies could be used against the city, and the men who commanded armies knew it. Julius Caesar. Into this unstable world, sometime around 100 BCE was born Gaius Julius Caesar. He was a patrician of ancient lineage, claiming descent from Venus herself, which was the sort of claim that in Rome was simultaneously ridiculous and entirely serious. He was clever, charming, strategically brilliant, extraordinarily ambitious, and possessed of a gift for political theatre that no Roman before him could match. He rose through the usual offices, forming political alliances, taking enormous debts to fund lavish public shows, making himself beloved by the Roman people and deeply suspicious to the Senate. In 60 BCE, he formed an informal alliance with the general Pompey, the most celebrated military man in Rome, and the wealthy financier Crassus. This arrangement, called the First Triumvirate, which is a grand name for essentially three powerful men agreeing to help each other. Caesar used this alliance to get himself appointed governor of Gaul, which in 58 BCE was mostly unconquered territory, stretching across what is now France and Belgium. What he did there over the next decade was remarkable. He conquered all of it. 8 years of almost continuous campaigning against dozens of different Gallic tribes, crossing the Rhine twice just to make a point, twice crossing to Britain just to say he had been there, suppressing revolts, fighting sieges, writing it all down in his war commentaries in clean, clear Latin that school children would be forced to read for the next 2,000 years. By 50 BCE, Gaul was Roman, and Caesar was famous, rich, and commanding a battle-hardened army that was devoted to him personally. The Senate, led by Pompey, was alarmed. They ordered Caesar to return to Rome without his army to lay down his command. Caesar came to the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy proper, where Roman law forbade a general to bring his army. He paused. He is said to have said the die is cast, which is a gambling metaphor and exactly the kind of thing Caesar would say. He crossed. Civil war. Caesar defeated Pompey and his senatorial allies in a series of campaigns across the Mediterranean. Pompey was murdered in Egypt. Caesar had affairs in Egypt with Cleopatra, fought more. Campaigns returned to Rome in triumph. He was appointed dictator not in the modern sense, but the old republican sense, a temporary emergency office, except that he held it not for the traditional 6 months, but for life. He was declared dictator perpetuo. He reformed the calendar, the Julian calendar, which with minor modifications is still our calendar today, which is a remarkably durable contribution from a man whose political career lasted less than 5 years. He was planning campaigns against Parthia, he was reorganizing the state, he seemed to be everywhere at once, and some senators grew convinced that he intended to make himself king. On the 15th of March 44 BCE, the Ides of March, a group of senators surrounded him in the theatre of Pompey. There were 23 stab wounds. Caesar died at the foot of a statue of his old rival Pompey, and the Republic, which his assassins thought they were saving, died with him. Augustus. And the birth of the empire. What followed was another round of civil wars because apparently Rome had not had quite enough of those. Caesar had been beloved by his soldiers and by much of the Roman people, and his assassination was not the clean liberation of the Republic that the conspirators had imagined. His great-nephew and adopted heir Octavian, 18 years old when Caesar died, formed his own triumvirate with Mark Antony, and Lepidus defeated the assassins at Philippi, and then inevitably fell into conflict with Antony. Antony had gone east, had allied himself with Cleopatra. Of Egypt had apparently become more Egyptian than Roman by some accounts, and had made the political mistake of publicly favouring Cleopatra in ways that Romans found insulting. Octavian framed the conflict not as a civil war between Romans, which would have been politically awkward, but as Rome versus the foreign queen of Egypt. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian won. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt and killed themselves. Octavian was now the undisputed master of the Roman world, and here is where he did something genuinely brilliant. He did not call himself king. He did not call himself dictator. He was very careful about that, very careful indeed. He gave back formal control of the state to the Senate and the traditional institutions, and then accepted it back again in the form of various extraordinary powers and honours, accumulating authority without the title. He was called Princeps First Citizen and Augustus the Revered One. He was also Imperator Commander, which gives us our word emperor. Augustus ruled Rome for over 40 years, dying in 14 CE, and he transformed it so completely and so carefully that most Romans probably did not notice exactly when the Republic ended and the Empire began, which was the point. He built in marble. He famously said he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He reformed the army, the administration, the tax system. He established the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of relative stability across the brick, Mediterranean world that would last for roughly 2 centuries. He was, in the judgment of most historians, the most consequential individual in Roman history. He also had tremendous difficulty finding a successor outliving most of his chosen heirs, which is the sort of irony that history enjoys. The Julio-Claudians. The dynasty Augustus founded, called the Julio-Claudians, because it wove together the Julian line of Caesar with the Claudian family. He produced some of the most fascinating and alarming rulers in Roman history. His stepson Tiberius came first, a capable general who turned out to be a deeply unhappy emperor, suspicious, withdrawn, spending his later years on the island of Capri while running the empire through letters and allowing a ruthless prefect named Sejanus to terrorize Rome. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the people of Rome reportedly celebrated in the streets. The next emperor was Caligula. Now, Caligula started reasonably well. The people loved him after the gloomy Tiberius, and then he became ill, some say severely, and when he recovered, something had changed. The stories about what followed are extraordinary. He declared himself a living god. He supposedly made his horse a consul, though historians debate whether this was a genuine act of madness or an elaborate insult to the Senate. He was spectacularly cruel, spectacularly extravagant, and was murdered by his own Praetorian Guard in 41 CE after less than 4 years in power. The guard, somewhat awkwardly, then found Caligula, his uncle Claudius, hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declared him emperor, which is not the most dignified way to attain supreme power, but it worked. Claudius was a surprise. He had been dismissed by his family as dim-witted and clumsy. He had a stammer and a limp, and had survived the dangerous court life of Caligula largely by being considered not worth killing. But he turned out to be a thoughtful and effective administrator. He completed the conquest of Britain that Caesar had started. He reformed the bureaucracy. He extended citizenship more broadly. He was eventually poisoned, probably by his wife Agrippina, to make way for her son. Nero. Nero began well, as Roman emperors often did, guided by his advisor, the philosopher Seneca, and the sensible prefect Burrus. And then, as the guiding hands loosened, he became something else entirely. He was the one who burned Rome in 64 CE, or rather, Rome burned while he was nearby, at Antium, and he famously, according to some accounts, played music, the fiddling of the later legend being anachronistic, but the spirit of the story, perhaps not far wrong. He blamed the Christians, one of the earliest persecutions of that community, and rebuilt a spectacular new Rome with a massive golden palace for himself at its centre. He had his mother killed. He had his first wife killed. He kicked his second wife to death while she was pregnant. He forced Seneca to commit suicide. And then his own generals and the Senate turned on him, and Nero, fleeing, killed himself in 68 CE, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies with me." Whether he actually said it or not, it is very Roman. The year of 4 emperors and the Flavians. The death of Nero ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and in the chaos that followed, Rome discovered something unsettling about the system Augustus had so carefully constructed. There was no clear mechanism for choosing a new emperor. In 69 CE, the year of 4 emperors, 4 different men claimed the title in rapid succession: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, each backed by different armies in different parts of the empire. It was a demonstration of something a Spanish governor named Galba had reportedly said on being acclaimed emperor, that the secret of the empire was that emperors could be made somewhere other than Rome. The legions on the Rhine made Vitellius, the legions in the east made Vespasian. And Vespasian won not through brilliant strategy, but through the grim arithmetic of having more soldiers in better positions. He founded the Flavian dynasty and was by common consent a good emperor. Practical, blunt, hard-working, famous for his dry humour. When he was dying and knew it, knowing that Roman tradition held that emperors became gods upon death, he reportedly said, "Oh dear, I think I am becoming a god," which is exactly the kind of thing you say when you want history to remember you. Well, his son Titus followed him. Brief reign beloved oversaw the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Pompeii in 79 CE, and then Titus his brother Domitian. Domitian was effective, but paranoid. He had people executed on suspicion, demanded to be addressed as Lord and God, and was eventually murdered by a palace conspiracy in 96 CE. His memory was condemned. By the Senate Damnatio Memoriae, his name chiselled off inscriptions, his statues broken, which was the Roman version of deleting someone, his social media accounts, the 5 good emperors. After Domitian, Rome entered the period that the historian Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, would later call the period in which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. He was perhaps being slightly optimistic, but he was onto something. The 5 emperors who ruled from 96 to 180 CE, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, Pius, Marcus Aurelius, are traditionally called the 5 good emperors, and they represent something remarkable in the history of autocracy, a succession of rulers who were generally competent, generally humane, and governed what was probably the most powerful and far-reaching empire the Western world had yet seen. Nerva was elderly and chosen by the Senate, a placeholder, but he established the crucial innovation of adopting a capable successor rather than relying on biological inheritance. Trajan was a Spanish general, the first emperor born outside Italy, who expanded the empire to its greatest extent, conquering Dacia in 2 brutal campaigns and Mesopotamia beyond, though that last conquest proved impossible to hold. He is considered one of the greatest Roman emperors, and if you see a very tall column in the centre of Rome, covered in a spiral of carved reliefs showing military campaigns, that is Trajan, column still standing after 2,000 years. Hadrian pulled back, recognised the empire was overstretched, consolidated borders, built his famous wall AC, Ross, northern Britain, not because he expected Scots to invade, but to define where Roman territory ended and to control movement. Hadrian is a fascinating figure, deeply cultured, obsessively enthusiastic about Greek philosophy and architecture. He redesigned the Pantheon in Rome, which still stands today with its perfect concrete dome. Antoninus Pius ruled for a remarkably peaceful 23 years, and is largely forgotten for it, which is either the fate of the competent or the sign of a truly successful reign, or perhaps both. And then Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is the philosopher-emperor, a man who genuinely did not want power, who spent his reign fighting wars on multiple frontiers that he found deeply exhausting and morally troubling, and who wrote his private philosophical journal, his Meditations, never intending it to be published, working through his Stoic beliefs about duty and impermanence and the nature of a good life. He writes things like, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength," which is the kind of thing that goes on inspirational posters now, but was written by an exhausted emperor in a military tent. Somewhere on the Danube, he also left the empire to his biological son, Commodus, which was a mistake, the crisis of the 3rd century. Commodus believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules. He would fight in the arena dressed as Hercules, killing animals and occasionally disabled people who had been dressed up as mythological creatures. He renamed Rome after himself, calling it Colonia Commodiana, which even his supporter, it's found embarrassing. He was strangled by a wrestler in his bath on New Year's Eve, 192 CE. After Commodus came another period of civil war, and then a series of emperors, some capable, some terrible, and then the 3rd century happened. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 CE, is one of those periods in history where everything that could go wrong seems to go wrong simultaneously. In 50 years, there were 26 emperors recognized by the Senate, and dozens more pretenders. Most of them died violently. The empire fragmented at one point. There were 3 separate pieces: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, led by the remarkable Queen Zenobia and the rump of Roman territory in between. Plague swept through the empire repeatedly. The Antonine Plague, and later the Plague of Cyprian, killed millions. The economy destabilized, the currency was debased, inflation ran wild. Barbarian groups, the Goths, the Alemanni, the Franks, pressed on every frontier. It is remarkable that Rome survived this period at all, but it did. Emperors like Aurelian's soldier reformer called Restitutor Orbis, meaning restorer of the world, reunified the empire by force of arms in the 270s. The empire was battered and transformed, but it was still there. Diocletian and Constantine. The man who really stabilized things was Diocletian, a soldier from Dalmatia who became emperor in 284 CE and ruled for 20 years. Diocletian looked at the problem of governing a vast empire and concluded that no single person could do it. So he created the Tetrarchy, the rule of four, two senior emperors called Ed Augusti and two junior emperors called Caesars, dividing the empire into manageable regions. He was practical and systematic. He reformed the army, reformed the tax system, reformed the currency, conducted a census, fixed prices in an edict that was detailed and probably unenforceable, but represented an extraordinary administrative ambition. He also conducted the last and most severe persecution of Christians, the Diocletianic persecution, which ultimately failed to suppress the faith, and in hindsight looks like trying to hold back a tide with your hands. Diocletian did something no emperor had done voluntarily since the Republic he retired. He grew cabbages in his palace in Split, and reportedly when asked to return to power said something along the lines of, "You should see my cabbages." Then came Constantine. Constantine, who came to power after another civil war, made a decision in 312 CE that changed the history of Western civilization. At the Battle of the Milvian Bridge against his rival Maxentius, he reportedly had a vision, a cross or a symbol in the sky, and instructed his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields. He won the battle. He credited the Christian God. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. Christianity was no longer persecuted, it was protected. Constantine himself was baptized on his deathbed. By the end of the 4th century under Theodosius, Christianity would be the official religion of the Roman Empire. The faith that had been thrown to lions in the arena now sat on the throne of the world. Constantine also moved, the capital east to a city on the Bosphorus that he named Constantinople, which became the centre of gravity of the empire and would remain a great city for over 1,000 years. The late empire and decline. The late Roman Empire is one of history's great, slow dramas, a civilization of extraordinary complexity and achievement, dealing with pressures it could manage but never quite solve. The empire was now divided more or less permanently into East and West, sharing a common identity and legal system but increasingly separate in their day-to-day governance. The Eastern Empire was richer, more urbanized, with a stronger tax base and more defensible borders, the wealth of the Greek-speaking East flowing into its capital Constantinople. The Western Empire was poorer, more frontier-heavy, with a longer and more porous border, and an agricultural economy that had never fully recovered from the 3rd century, and the pressures on those borders were increasing. The great migrations were underway, peoples moving westward out of Central Asia, the Huns driving other peoples before them, a cascade of displacement and pressure that would eventually push through the Roman frontiers. The Goths, settled within Roman territory by treaty in 376 CE, rebelled when corrupt Roman officials cheated and mistreated them. At Adrianople in 378 CE, the Eastern Emperor Valens met the Gothic army and was defeated and killed, the first time a Roman emperor had died in battle against a foreign enemy for over a century. This was significant. Rome tried and partially succeeded in managing the Gothic presence using Goth, hick soldiers in Roman armies, making Gothic leaders Roman generals, the line between Roman and barbarian becoming increasingly blurred. A Gothic general named Stilicho, half Vandal by birth, became the most powerful man in the Western Empire under the Emperor Honorius. In 410 CE, Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome. It had not been sacked by a foreign enemy for 800 years. The symbolic impact was enormous. Augustine in North Africa wrote his great work The City of God, partly in response to pagan Romans, blaming the catastrophe on the abandonment of the old gods. The Western Empire lurched on. Emperors came and went with alarming frequency, many of them children, real power held by generals who were often of barbarian origin. Attila and the Huns swept through Gaul and Italy in the 440s and 450s, extracting enormous tribute, and were turned back not by Roman armies, but by a combination of diplomacy, disease, and the personal intervention of Pope Leo I, who met Attila on the road to Rome and persuaded him to turn back. What Leo said to Attila, no one quite knows. But it worked. The fall of the Western Empire. The Western Roman Empire did not so much fall as slowly dissolve. The date traditionally given is 476 CE, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor. A 16-year-old boy with the beautiful tragic irony of being named Romulus Augustulus. Little Romulus, little Augustus, bearing the names of the founder and the great emperor in miniature at the very end of things. Odoacer did not bother to claim the Western imperial title. He simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and governed Italy as a king. The Eastern Empire, which would continue as the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years until Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, recognized him as a kind of regional administrator, and that was that. Or rather, that was not quite that, because the fall of Rome was not experienced by most people living through it as a single dramatic collapse. The roads were still there, the aqueducts still flowed in places, Latin was still spoken, Roman law still structured society. The bishops of the Catholic Church had inherited much of the administrative structure of the empire. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman rule in the west, the Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in North Africa, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks in Gaul, styled themselves as heirs to Rome using Roman titles employing Roman administrators, aspiring to Roman culture. What had ended was the political unity. What continued transformed and fragmented but continuous was the civilization, the legacy of Rome. And so we come to the question that always comes at the end of these long journeys through history. What did it all mean? Rome lasted in its various forms for over 1,000 years in the West, and nearly 2,000 if you count Byzantium. It grew from a cluster of huts on a hill above the Tiber to encompass Britain and Egypt and Spain and Syria, the whole Mediterranean world and beyond, and then contracted again, and finally dissolved. Along the way, it gave the world, or rather bequeathed to later civilizations as a kind of inheritance, an extraordinary collection of things. Its language Latin became the foundation of the Romance languages: Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, and provided the international vocabulary of science and law and religion for a millennium after the empire's fall. Roman law, the idea that there are general principles of justice that apply to all citizens, that contracts should be honoured, that the accused should be heard before they are condemned. These ideas were encoded in Roman legal texts and eventually flowed into the legal systems of most of the Western world. Roman engineering, the arch, the vault, the dome concrete, the road, the aqueduct. These were not just useful in their own time, but provided the technical vocabulary for the architecture of medieval Europe and beyond. The Pantheon in Rome, built under Hadrian, has a concrete dome that no one in Europe could equal for 13 centuries. Roman political vocabulary still structures how we talk about government, the Senate, the Republic, the word constitution, the concept of citizenship, the idea that law should govern even the powerful. Christianity, the religion of most of the Western world, and much else besides, was shaped in its institutional form by the Roman Empire, its councils and hierarchies and geographic organization reflecting the world it was born into. And perhaps more subtly, the idea of Rome itself, the idea that a diverse collection of peoples could be organized under common laws and governance and call themselves by a single name that was Rome, is most influential contribution. Every major European power for the next 1,500 years, Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon, the British Empire, imagined itself in some sense as Rome's continuation or successor. The shadow of Rome falls across all of Western history. Closing. And so we reach the end of our long journey tonight. From Romulus and his unfortunate brother on their disputed hill, to the last pale flicker of an empire in the form of a teenage boy with a grandiose name from the mud of the early republic, to the marble of the Augustan age from the Punic, wars to the fall of Carthage from Caesar crossing the Rubicon to Marcus Aurelius writing his private thoughts in a military camp. More than 1,000 years. Millions of people. Countless stories we will never know. The soldiers and farmers and slaves and merchants and priests and philosophers who built the roads and ran the aqueducts and ground the grain and taught the children and kept the whole extraordinary machine running. Rome was not built in a day. As everyone knows, and it did not fall in a day either, it built and expanded and struggled and adapted and contracted and transformed, and then it became something else, and that something else became something else again, and here we are. Somewhere in the infrastructure of the world you live in the language you think in the laws that govern you, in the buildings around you, in the way your calendar is organised, Rome is still there, quietly present, the way old things are, not gone, just changed. Now the fire is low, the last legions have marched past, the Tiber still flows in the dark, and Rome, that strange eternal city, is sleeping, just like you. Good night.